Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 287 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am back. It is me, the Orange Tank, Neelan, to have some sort of recovery from the dismal effort that was the two of you.
You're here to right the wrongs.
You called
Exactly.
us the worst duo in board gaming, and now you're here
I
1 week
think-
later.
I think everyone will agree that was well-deserved considering where the topic went. I mean, or we could just talk about what board games you want to keep eating. I don't know.
We were trying to move the podcast into a different direction. We're trying to
yeah,
combine both
capture some of that culinary market.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing. This week on the show, I guess I should introduce the two of you. Hello, Green and Red Tanks.
Otherwise known as the worst duo in board games.
Yes, exactly. This week on the show, what we are going to be talking about is the sort of the time and place that board games occupy. Whether that means that games or mechanics or systems become dated with time, whether they occupy certain trends in board game history. We're going to be delving into all of that into the second half of the episode. But before we get there, let's talk about some of the games that we've been playing this week. And this week, Kellen and I have been playing Planet etuC. I've been playing Undaunted, Stalingrad, and Battle of Britain. And Mark has been playing Tycoon, India 1981. Kellen, why don't you kick us off with Planet etuC?
All right. The name of this game almost made it ineligible for coverage on the Board Game Barrage podcast. I thought it was just a stupid name for space, and then the first group I played it with correctly informed me that it is the word cute backwards. And the product copy confirms that this is Planet etuC, where cute creatures live their lives peacefully. No comment. Taiki Shinzawa is one of my favorite board game designers. You may have heard us cover his games. I particularly love American Bookshop and Maskmen, but many others have recently played a lot of his games, including Ghost of Christmas and Nine Lives, Big Top, another game we recently covered. And there was a game that I always wanted to try called, and again, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, so maybe Planet Cute is better. I thought it was Ambient Abyss, but Ambient Abyssal, I'm sure, just write in. A ladder climbing, it's not a trick taker, it's a ladder climbing game. We covered that this past week. In Planet Cute, you can only play with 2 or 3 players, and you are playing a game that most reminds me of Maskman. It's like Maskman, but simpler. That's the TLDR. In the game, you can play only 1 or 2 cards, which is great because when you're in Haggis, you can play a ton of cards and it gets complicated. In Planet Cute, you can play 1 card or you can play 2 cards. In addition, you can make 2 types of combinations. You can play a pair of numbers, you can play 1 number, or you can play a pair of colors. The game calls it a pair of symbols. I have no idea why. There are no symbols on these cards. It is a pair of colors. And then, but what makes the game interesting is that when you only play a single card, the next player has the option to agree and amplify the trick that's being played in either a number game or a color game. That is to say that all the colors have sort of a rank, starting with the rank of gray and going with the obviously best rank of purple. And so I could play a 3 of green, a mid-tier card, and then Mark has a choice. He could play a 4, 5, or 6 of the gray, in which case he'd be locking us into a number war. Or he could play a 1 of a suit higher than green, including the illustrious purple. What makes it particularly fun or spicy or mind-bending is that the second card played could actually both be better in both games, and then the third player must use their knowledge of improv to agree and amplify and choose and select which type of game they're playing. The first person to go out a card scores 2 points, second person scores 1, first player to 6 wins the game. Planet Cute. The card art on this I do not find to be cute. I find it to be gross. The aliens are gross.
Okay, yeah, the aliens are gross. The art is good, but the aliens are gross.
I don't even know how to respond to that. The cards are 80% ugly aliens. So you agree that 80% of the card is ugly, but it's cute?
I guess I just like the art style is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, they're very like sludge monster adjacent.
Great. I will not bury the lead. I liked Planet Cute. And in fact, it reveals more the more you play it in a way that I found satisfying. Sometimes it felt kind of obvious what you would do, and then I saw a way other people were playing, and then I'm like, oh, damn, and adjusted my play and was able to sort of play it a little bit better. I think it's going to slide a little bit under the radar. It's a little unassuming. It's not as showy as Maskmen, but I hope it is much or as growy as Maskmen. Neelan, what did you think of Planet Cute?
Yeah, I liked it. Mossman is the obvious comparison. I will say this, not to undercut anything you're saying. I do like Mossman better. I think it's worth saying that. But I do think that what Planet etuC makes up for is in its simplicity. I think it plays cleaner, it plays simpler, while sort of hiding its depths, I would say, better than Mossman does. I liked it. I would say I tend to like shedding games more than most other trick takers. So
I wouldn't say that out loud, Neelan. They're writing their hate mail right now, Neelan. It's already happening, one card at a time.
The first word of that email is actually.
But yeah, this had just like a pleasant friend sitting around a table simplicity to it, where you didn't feel like you were too bogged down by the mechanical side of it, which I would say is a problem with Maskmen. But yeah, lovely game.
Yep. Excited to have it. Again, how many trick takers / ladder climbers can one own? We are testing how big that box is. Planet etuC, Planet Cute will stay in that box for now.
So
dramatic
I have...
pause. But don't put that in there, of course. Just but the actual pause, right? You'll do that.
Leave the pause.
Where it's like, people will be like, is the episode over? Did they end on a high note? Or
just maybe like the first 2 seconds of the music.
Yeah.
And bring it
well,
back.
We could do that, yeah.
I am going to be talking about a Undaunted double feature. Just to quickly revisit my experience with Undaunted Stalingrad. I was just in South Africa, where I've played the second half of my Stalingrad campaign with my brother. Loved it. I'm not going to rehash everything about Undaunted Stalingrad. It is Undaunted with campaign mechanics. I really enjoyed the way the campaign came together. The ramifications of having specific units that were unique to me and that my brother never had access to was interesting. The story of his squads and like all the specifics of how, mine was like the decimated faction. His was had this second wave halfway through. It was just really good. The way that the final scenario kind of brings together all of basically the choices and ramifications of the previous scenarios into like one big grand battle, I thought was fantastic. I would highly recommend this if you enjoy Undaunted and have someone that you're, be willing to play 15 straight games of it. But never got stale, loved it throughout.
Is that narrative completely emergent, or is there a narrative arc that is written into the game?
You know what? I actually don't know the answer to that. It's very hard to like necessarily unpick which parts are bespoke and which parts emerge. I will say this, I got the sense that a lot of it was. So the way that the game doles out stories kind of through paragraphs you're told to read, and there are at the very least like 16 or 17 different endings to the campaign in terms of just like massive chunks of text that we just didn't read because we were told to read ending H or whatever, So
even that is more written narrative driven than I thought that it would be. I thought it was like a series of missions or scenarios, but there's more narrative even written into the game than just that.
Yeah, it's pretty slight. And Kellen can maybe talk to this a little bit because he played the opening scenario with me. But like basically each of you reads one briefing, but you're reading it to yourself. You're not reading it out loud. It's kind of like just like the dialogue that your troops are having, that your generals are having behind the scenes, which is fine in and of itself because you kind of get this little personal story that your opponent doesn't even really know. And some of it is like them talking about like their anticipation. Sometimes you get like secret objectives that your opponent doesn't know about, and that's like hinted at in the prelude to the mission. So that's really cool. And like that changes dramatically over time. Like for example, if I unlocked a specific unit at some point in the campaign, it will be referred to further down the line. and that might not happen if you just never unlock that whole section of the campaign. It's very clever. I will say, those are just very brief story packets going into scenario. It's not like an elaborate narrative, but it's quite good, quite well handled, and I think that the way it all ties together felt more emergent than most of these campaigns tend to, with the exception of, something like a King's Dilemma, where that's the whole vibe of that game.
Right.
But yeah, very happy with that. We also played a couple of scenarios of the newest in the Undaunted series, Battle of Britain. And this is a pretty big departure for the series, because instead of being closer to war game systems, this is recreating like dogfighting games. So if you are familiar, I don't know the classics of this genre, but like for some of the stuff that's more recent, like X-Wing, where you have ships and they all have momentum, and an important part of the movement is the fact that they can't just pivot on the spot. If you're turning a ship 90 degrees, it's going to move forward in 90 degrees. So anticipation of where a plane is going to be is a big part of this. And the way that Undaunted implements this is every time you take an action with a plane, it must move forward. So depending on the speed of the plane, it's either going to move up to 3 spaces, but it must move at least 1. So there is this sense that you sort of have to plan movement into taking the actions of your planes, which is interesting when you combine that with Undaunted system, where the amount of actions a plane is going to take is dependent on the cards you have in that deck. So your ability for a card to move is dependent on how many cards you've reinforced into your deck. And that kind of just determines the flow of combat a little bit. Is this plane going to move a lot? Well, I know that he's happened to reinforce that plane a lot. Therefore, I need to extra anticipate that that's maybe going to be further ahead than where I need to be, because in order to do attacks in this game, you have to have the planes in your firing line. So, it can't just be an arbitrary place on the board. It has to be in your front arc of your plane or directly behind you, depending on where the guns are. So the positioning and all of that is a lot more important. There's also this neat mechanic where your planes in your squadron, in order to get maximum benefit from the cards, have to be within a certain distance of each other. So say they're in comms range of each other. So there's this sense that you're keeping squadrons together. You can't just have your planes immediately split apart and do their own thing and sort of become free agents. Otherwise, they're basically operating at a disadvantage. So that was neat. I will say that it didn't land as well with us, because I don't think either of us is as big a fan of that genre. Worrying about positioning was not something that I found very appealing, versus just wanting to know I was strategically placing my troops in the ways that you would in a normal Undaunted game. That was just much more the flavor of this type of game that I was into. But I think it's a very neat game. I'm always surprised by how much they do with this system. It's definitely not my favorite in the Undaunted series by any stretch of the imagination, though.
Does it feel very Undaunted-y, or does it feel it seems like with undoubtedly quite a departure from it, but does it retain a lot of the Undaunted flavor?
Yes and no. Because the core structure of the mechanics are there, right? So you're still doing all the things you would expect in that style of deck builder. You're still bolstering the planes that you want to activate more. You're still bidding for initiatives in the same way. 80% of the game is still mechanically the same, but it just feels substantially different. So I wouldn't say it feels like an Undaunted game, because all of the Undaunted games have tried to replicate war games up until now.
Right.
But yeah, if anything, it's a cool experiment. And that's going to maybe sound a little bit more dismissive than I intend, but I guess it's telling that I don't necessarily want to go back to Battle of Britain as much as I did. I don't think the system works as well for the dogfighting game as it does for the war game.
The
that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds cool.
But yeah, that was Undaunted Battle of Britain and Undaunted Stalingrad. Both of these were sent to us as review copies, by the way.
So, Neelan mentions review copies, and we've mentioned before that while we do get review copies, and of course make sure, as Neelan just did, to disclose whenever we're covering one, we actually get much fewer than you might imagine. That said, we do get a number of unsolicited requests to review games, and for the most part we decline. Often they're for upcoming Kickstarters that we know aren't really for us, like a lot of Cards Against Humanity type stuff. Other times they come from relatively inexperienced or unknown designers, and we worry that we might be wasting both ours and the other person's time because maybe we're reviewing a game that isn't quite polished or whatever. So that's a bit of the backstory for how I got my hands on a review copy of Tycoon: India 1981. Now, right off the bat, I'm thinking that Sidhan Chand, the designer of the game, knows his target audience here because he's got the colon right in the title, and he knows we're always happy to see that. And he's also got that 1981 in there, and I think he's trying to give me 18XX vibes with a date there. So I think he really knew his target audience. So I, of course, opened the email, and Sid Hans describes this game as a grand economic strategy board game. And all three of those things, and I know I'm in. So we got the review copy. Some things about this designer and the publisher, which is Zenwood Games. This is a game about India, obviously, which is by an Indian designer, produced, in my understanding, completely in India. So that's a pretty cool side of things. Though I have to say that soon after I accepted the offer to have the game sent over to be reviewed all the way from India, I started panicking that I was going to have Chand go through all this for a game that, as a heavy economic game, was going to have to clear a fairly high bar for me, and I was worried he was going to do all this and I was going to end up not liking it. Let's see if I do or not. So finally, let's talk about the game. In Tycoon, India 1981, you're running a company in a post-colonial India that has been left pretty shaky after the departure of the British, and you're trying to build it up. That sounds sort of heavy as a backstory, and the game is certainly I would say, mid to heavy economic game, but it's not maybe as heavy as that makes it sound. So there's a lot going on in this game, but I really want to give a quick thumbnail of how the game works mechanically, because I think it's pretty easy to say that a game is like this game or that game with a twist or two, but of the twists in Tycoon is where I think the game really shines. So this is a game that's going to be played over the course of 7 rounds, each round made up of 4 phases. The first thing that happens is that the player that is the Tycoon, the titular Tycoon in this game, which is basically the first player, is going to select a region of the board to activate. This is not going to make a lot of sense now until I describe more of the game, but basically the map of India, which you're building upon, is split into 4 regions, and the lead player picks one of the regions, and for every building that anybody has in that region, they get a small benefit. So that's the first thing that happens. So let's talk about this titular Tycoon a little bit more. So in addition to being the lead player and determining who gets the benefits in that first round, the Tycoon also gets an extra action in the actions phase, which is coming up later and is the meat of the game. So while most players during the action phase get 2 actions, the Tycoon gets 3 actions. So it's a relatively big thing that you want to go for. And the ownership of the Tycoon doesn't just go around the table. It's something you sort of bid on. More about that later. So you get that first activating region phase, which is basically determining who gets some benefits. It's a really quick phase. Then there's an event phase. Now, this isn't really what it sounds like. It's not like a random event card that is drawn and affects players. It's basically a bid for one of 2 what are called policy cards, which amount to usually like abilities that are either passive or one time, or like a bonus end of game scoring thing. So you're bidding on a card that will benefit you either right now, throughout the rest of the game, sort of like a power, like a small power, or give you a specific end of game scoring. This is a closed fist auction where players are going to be bidding one of the 2 currencies in the game. There are rupees, which are the economic currency which are used to bid for industries, which comes up later. But right now you're going to be bidding with promoters, which basically like represent lobbyists, which are the other currency. So you're going to bid for these policy cards using your promoters. You're going to bid in a closed fist, trying to win one of the policies. And here's where you have the first interesting twist of the game. So if someone other than the Tycoon player wins the bid, they pay those promoters to the Tycoon, which can be a powerful and hard resource to come by. These promoters can be tough to get. So that's another added benefit of being the Tycoon, is that if somebody else wins this bid, you get all the promoters. The losers of the bid, the players who don't win, don't get the bid back, but they immediately transfer those promoters that they used to bid into this like separate location on the board, which sort of activates the promoters, and they're used to take these powerful strategy actions, which we'll talk about later. So you don't get your bid back, you don't lose your bid, you sort of activate them. So this becomes an interesting thing where you'll often find yourself in a place where you want to lose this bid because you want to load up on these strategy actions later, and the only way that you can, again, take these strategy actions is to have these activator promoter chips in this like activator region. So it's a sort of interesting decision you have to make in the bidding. It's not just I want to win or I want to lose. Like sometimes you want to like thread the needle. So that's the second phase. Third phase is another bid, this time for the industry cards, which is sort of like the heart of your economic engine. This is used with the rupees. So here, instead of using the promoters, you're actually using the cash that you've got. And then again, you got another very clever aspect to this where it's a twice around bid, where every time it comes around to you, you need to either bid more than the highest bid or drop out of the bidding. And then the top 2 bidders are going to get a chance to purchase these industry cards, with the added benefit that the top bidder gets to be the Tycoon for the next round. So it's like a nice thing to win because, first of all, you get to be the Tycoon and get another action for the next round. You also get to have the first pick of these industry cards. But this is, again, a situation where sometimes you want to be second place. You don't necessarily want to bid the highest because that can be expensive in a game where money is tight, but you want to get one of the cards. So it's another situation where often you'll want to thread the needle and finish second because you'll still get a card, but you won't have to bid the highest amount. If you lose this bid, you get those promoter tokens that I mentioned again. But this time, rather than getting them put into the active spot on the board where you get to use them later, they go to your supply. So it's a nice benefit for losing, but they're not quite that powerful because they're not activated yet. Another interesting thing, as I mentioned, is this is a twice around bid. And the twice around nature of it didn't really strike me as consequential when I read it in the rulebook. Like, oh, it's twice around. That's sort of like, why would you do that when you can do either bid until you drop or once around? But I think that sometimes with a once around, the early bidders don't really have a way to figure out what they should bid. So that very first bid, you'd be like, oh, I don't know what to bid. Like, should I bid high? Should I bid low? What is a good bid here? The way that it goes twice around makes it so that first bid is not like sort of punishing if you bid wrong. You get another chance at it, but you don't have to keep going around and around, so that doesn't drag out. So it actually really feels like it hits the sweet spot for bidding, which I didn't expect, and I hadn't really seen in other games. So I thought that was a cool take. So then that's the third phase. Finally, the fourth phase, which is where the bulk of the game is happening, the action phase. So here you get to take two actions. They must be different types of actions. If you're the Tycoon, as I mentioned earlier, you get 3 actions, but they all have to be different. The phases you can choose from are build, where you're going to be building these industry cards. So the industry cards that you bought in that last phase I just talked about, where you were bidding with rupees, you have them, but you haven't quite built them yet. You sort of acquired them. So then you actually can take this build action to build them and put them on the board. The interesting thing here is that the cost to build have to do with these 6 different tracks that there are that represent like the different sort of like economies in India. And the amount you pay and who you pay it to depend on who is leading that track. So, for example, if I'm building a card and it requires the green agricultural track, that's going to determine how much a cost is. And let's say Neelan is winning. Then I'm paying that cost to Neelan. And not only am I paying it to Neelan, but if Neelan is high on that track, I'm going to be paying him more. And if I'm leading that track, I don't have to pay anything because I'm leading the track. So it's it makes that track situation where, you can get tracks in games and they can be pretty boring and just sort of feel like an afterthought. Here you have some interactivity to it because you really need to sort of know who's moving up on tracks. And if somebody is pushing up a track, you are more incentivized to follow that or keep that in mind when buying cards because you're going to have to pay them out potentially a higher amount of money. So that's the first action. Second action is that you can buy a share from another player. This is another interesting aspect. So you start the game with a number of shares in your company. You can't buy them yourself, but other players can buy them from you. And then at the end of the game, whoever has the best economy, their shares become worth the most. So it's this weird thing where like if somebody's winning the economy game, somebody's got this really great engine, you can really subvert that or sort of leech off of it by buying a bunch of their shares. You're giving them money because the shares that you buy cost money and they get progressively more expensive. So you're actually sort of funding them, which is a weird twist. But you're also going to definitely benefit at the end of the game by having the shares of like the strongest economic player, which is a really cool thing. There's another action, which is muster, which is taking those promoters and activating them. So it's like the way I mentioned earlier, where you can lose that bid to make your promoters instantly activated. Here's like a full action you have to take. So it's like an action you want to not take by losing that previously mentioned bid. There is another action, which is a politics, which is basically gives you revenue based on the policy cards you've bought. And then there's the strategy action, which is these powerful actions you can take, but the way you take them is by spending your activated promoters. So it's like all these really strong things you can do in the game, but you have to take this like usually 2-step process of taking your promoters from your own supply, getting them into the active pool, and then spending from the active pool. So it's sort of an interesting second avenue of this second economy. And then you do that for 7 rounds, and then the game ends. But here's like the best twist of the entire game, okay? So at the end of the game, you're going to determine 2 things. Who has the best economy? And that is primarily based on the industry cards you've bought. So the industry cards come in different levels. Some cost more and will give you more income throughout the game. Some cost less. But at the end of the game, you tally up who has the most powerful economy, and they win the sort of economic part of the game. Okay. Then there's like a victory point track. It's got some other name, but basically it's like victory points that you're accruing throughout the course of the game. And so whoever has the most victory points wins that aspect of the game. If you win both, you win the game straight out. Okay. But if you don't, those two players are the only ones eligible, and then whoever has acquired the most favorite tokens throughout the course of the game is the winner. Favorite tokens are not really a currency, but this third victory aspect of the game that you can acquire through different aspects of the game that I mentioned before. Like you'll get one for building in certain locations on the map. You'll get some for taking that politics action and getting revenue. There's just ways to get them throughout the course of the game, and they're a hidden currency that you whenever you get it, you just put it behind your shield. And so you can get them in little drips here and there. And then also at the end of the game, there are goal cards that tell you if you've achieved so much in this sort of level, you get some favor points. And if you've achieved this, and in addition, you have a hidden goal card that give you a way that you specifically and privately can acquire these favorite tokens. And so it's this really interesting thing of yes, I have this great economy going, I'm really chugging along. But first of all, does somebody have a lot of my stock? Because if they do, I'm helping them win the economy game. But even if I win the economy game outright, if I don't win the victory point game, it comes to this third thing that I have to be paying attention to. So it led to a really interesting moment in our game where I was really doing well in my economy. I was chugging along, I had this great tableau in front of me of these industry cards, and I felt really strong about it, getting nice revenue, all that stuff. And then I realized I'm sort of lagging in the victory point game, and I don't have any idea where I am relative to other players in favor. And so while I'm feeling really great about my economy, and I felt really great about how I was playing, I'm oh, you got to really pay attention to what's going on, because, okay, Eric is leading now in the victory points, and I don't think that Cameron's going to catch him. I don't know if I can catch him, and that means, wait, how well has he been doing on the favors? And so I had to pivot in the middle of the game and go okay, I feel like I can lock down this economy. If I keep an eye on it, I'll be okay. I've got to devote now everything to winning both, because I don't feel confident that I'm going to win this third tiebreaker. So now I got to dominate both. And it's funny because you have these two ways to win. Again, the economy and the victory points, and they sort of synergize throughout the game. So it's not a situation where you are focusing on economy and then you have to sort of sacrifice the victory points. If you're doing well in one, you're doing well in the other, and you can pivot and sort of change your focus and try to magnify one thing. And so I was able to do it, but it was close, and it was just really interesting that if I hadn't won the two aspects, who knows who would have won with the favors. So to sum it up, I actually really, really liked this game a lot. I was extremely pleasantly surprised. This felt to me a lot. Now, the games aren't the same at all, but in terms of the level of pleasant surprise for a game that I hadn't really heard of, and from a relatively new designer. Mr. Chand has other games, but I had not heard of them, and they're relatively not super well known, but felt a lot like City of the Big Shoulders, a heavy economic game from a relatively unknown designer that really wowed me. I'm really, really excited about this, and I will definitely be getting my own copy. I should also say that in addition to being a review copy, which of course I've mentioned, I was playing a prototype copy. It seems to be close to final, but not necessarily there. But the art, which I think will carry over, is lovely. It has very strong brass vibes, like that sort of dark industrial thing, but very nice and classy looking. Really, a really, really great surprise. It should be on Kickstarter when you hear this. And if you're into medium heavy economic games, I would suggest at least taking a look. I mean, I only played it a couple times, so I can't say if aspects of it are necessarily broken. Didn't feel like that to me. But, if it's a sound game, I think it's pretty close to a can't miss for somebody who's into heavy economic games. The twists in it are clever and feel like they are not only novel, but really help the game. And that having to focus on the two victory point conditions and the third one on the side just felt really interesting to me. Kept the game interesting throughout.
I love that victory condition idea. The idea, anytime you sort of have two competing win conditions, that is just a neat way to handle it. Did you think it was viable that I guess based on what you were saying, it sounds like it would be very plausible that someone could win both of those?
Yes, although I will say, it is fantastic that they are interconnected, because I think sometimes you get games like this where the winner comes from a pool of a certain number of players who have won these other sub-games. It can be that, you either have to focus on one or the other, and this, again, they're mingled so you don't have to. But I will say that on our second play, where players were more accustomed to it, that became a much harder proposition. People knew that, okay, if I'm not going to win this, I really need to make sure that I'm going to win these other aspects. And I also now have to really keep an eye on the favors and who are getting the favors. So, yeah, I think winning both is a definite possibility, but I think it's something that is going to be, less likely the more you know the game, and you're going to have to keep an eye on juggling the favors in all three sort of aspects of it. So that is Tycoon: India 1981 by Zenwood Games. That was a review copy that we got, and it should be on Kickstarter now if you're interested.
Very cool. So before we move on, just another quick reminder that we are going to be at PAX Unplugged in December this year. So if you're planning on making your way to Philadelphia for that convention, we'd love to hang out with you. If you see us around, we'll almost certainly have some or other meetups.
And not only are we going to be at PAX Unplugged, but as we did last year, even though we didn't attend PAX Unplugged, we will be running the mass trade at the PAX Unplugged. So if you're interested in doing mass trades and you are going to PAX Unplugged, you'll be doing the BGB mass trade. So another thing to look forward to.
Okay, let's get into the feature topic this week, which is this idea of games and mechanics and systems and themes or whatever aspects of board games having a time and place. Like, could they become dated? Do they have trends that we've noticed where a certain thing was popular at a certain point in time? I think one of the clearest ways to think about this is this idea that there are mechanics that just don't get used as much, for example, anymore. Do any of you have some opening thoughts on this idea? Mechanics that were either of their time, you don't see so much anymore, or had a brief spurt a few years ago and maybe are on the way out?
For me, when it comes to talking about mechanisms that could be considered outdated, the ones that I sort of gravitated towards were the ones that when people mention that they're parts of a game can be the sort of the most divisive. Like when people hear that game has X mechanism, they say, well, okay, I'm not, it's not for me, or it feels like it may be sort of passé. And the four that jumped out to me were roll and move, player elimination, memory, games with memory aspect, and take that. I think those are the four most, not even divisive. Divisive would indicate that there's balanced pros and cons, but I feel like those four are almost universally, not universal, but almost like mostly universally frowned upon when it comes to mechanisms in board games nowadays.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that there is like some sense to which there are, and those being the specific call-outs, where people will see that in a game and more often than not just have this sort of like negative recoil, like, oh, that's, no, I'm not a fan of that. Oh, I'm not a fan of player elimination in my games. Right. Like these sort of very, very like visceral reactions to those mechanics still being utilized. And that was the kickoff point for this idea that there are these mechanics that some might describe as dated, as having a time and place in the history of board games, which in the case of those mechanics is very specifically in the past. You don't see them so much anymore.
But it's like, Neelan, do you... Like, it's a yes or no. We're all beating around the bush.
Does it have to be?
No, yes. There are only two options. How do you...
Okay.
This is what the people want. Can board game mechanisms become outdated, yes or no?
I think yes. Like,
okay,
if I had to
talking.
take a hard
Sorry, you had one word.
Damn it.
Mark. No, sorry. We'll get to the why. Sorry. That came off worse than worse than even I intended.
No.
Mark.
Not at all.
Can
really funny.
Board game mechanisms become outdated?
I'm going to say no.
Thank God. A voice of reason. 2-1. Board game mechanisms cannot become outdated. That's a fact.
Neelan, defend yourself.
Neelan, defend yourself. Now,
so the yes, if I can like at least texture that answer a little bit, I think there are all good examples of games that utilize these mechanics. That's not to say that I hate every game with player elimination or every game with
isn't that what you just said?
No. That's not what I just said. I did not say that.
And don't edit it together so it sounds like he said, I hate
no, I'm on your side. I'm
elimination.
going to edit it together the way it benefits us, not like I usually do, the way it only benefits me.
I hate every game with player elimination. I think, though, that there is definitely some sense that there is a reason, not to say that to cater to the idea that what is popular is good, etc., but there is a reason that these things do fall out of favor. I think there are good reasons to not want to have player elimination in your game. And, I don't think the point is necessary to go into the specifics on any of these, but there are definite downsides and disadvantages. I think player elimination is the easiest one just to say in one sentence, which is say you are going to have people not playing the game that they signed up to play. There are very good reasons why we would look at that as a negative. And I think that there is some sense to which that was not necessarily something that was at the front mind of design choices in older games, but in the sense where games do have to hit hard early, and they have to hit hard in the first couple of games of them because of the cadence of board game releases now, I think it is important that you don't have someone playing their first game of a game and be sitting out for half of it, for example.
So, but it's like, Nealon, we had a pandemic, right?
Yes.
And what was popular to do during the pandemic was different than what is popular to do now, right?
Sure.
And so is it a fad? Is it outdated? Or is it just what people wanted at a specific place and time based on external factors like the pandemic?
I think it can be all of these things. I don't think they're necessarily...
Are you saying baking sourdough is outdated?
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't dare to
You
say
better
that.
not. There you go.
I do think that's interesting, though, because I do think that does speak to something else about this topic that we haven't necessarily spoken about yet, is the idea of trends, right? Like, is it fair to say that, if a mechanic necessarily isn't just like on the way out and will probably never come back, that there was just a point in time where it was in vogue and it could resurge at some point in the future? I think one of the best examples of this for me feels like roll and write games. Like, roll and write games have a long storied history. I mean, they have an intense degree of popularity with stuff like Yahtzee, but then they resurged in a big way, I would say probably around 5 years ago, thereabouts. And I do think that there is some sense, at least from my perspective, that roll and writes have had their heyday to some extent, at least for now. Like, there is some sense that they're not as popular, not actively as many being developed now as they were like 2 years ago. And that did seem like a big trend in like a mechanic or a system.
So how does this compare and contrast, Nealon, just because it's a 2v1 now, so I don't even need to question mark on anything, to like, and not to make it about video games all the time, but like, there are video game, I don't know if I can use the word mechanisms, there are video game techniques that very much are outdated or antiquated due to technology, and you're the one who generally believes that board games are improving the most over time. I am the one who is so jaded as to not believe it at all, and in fact, the new games suck worse than the old games. I don't know. I guess I just see player elimination is probably a really easy one, or even memory as something that like people like or they don't. But to sort of make the claim, which is what you're doing, because you came up with this episode topic, that like memory games are outdated, says me, and no 5-year-old should play a memory-based game in my 2023. I don't know. How do you get off?
Yeah.
Not saying
Agreed.
any of that for starters, but like I think my perspective on all of this is more like from the outside, right? Which is to say that I'm not making any judgment on any of that. Like I quite like some games that use these mechanics, to be clear, but I do think we can broadly identify what the players at large are saying, I suppose. And it is interesting because it's funny because I'm actually not to, again, we just keep caveating saying not to say talk about video games too much, but I do think I'm more willing to say that I can be more specific about trends in video games that I miss, that I think are bad, that we've lost. And like, couch co-op, for example, is an easy one. Or, split screen gaming, for example, having multiple players playing on one system is something that did go away pretty dramatically. And I think that sucks. Like, I do wish that still existed. I'm not here to say that any one of these mechanics or systems that we shouldn't lament the loss of, but I do think that we could definitely broadly identify that they have, to some extent, fallen out of favor.
I will say that when it comes to these mechanisms, I tend to sort of agree with most people insofar as that, like, when they see these mechanisms being touted as a part of a game, they sort of, like, frown upon it or think that they're outdated. But on the other hand, whenever I hear about a game that takes one of these quote-unquote outdated mechanisms and does it in a modern way with modern sensibilities, that goes from like being a game that I'm actively not interested in to being one that I'm very, very interested in. Like when the designer will say, hey, look, I know you don't like take that. I know you don't like roll and move. I know you don't like player elimination, but I'm going to do it in a way that makes sense for today and takes all the lessons we've learned in board game design and, updates this aspect of the game. I love that. That makes me extremely interested. We talked about this pre-show, but the way Ankh dealt with player elimination, the way that the bottom players merged together, it's a divisive way to do it, but it's very interesting. And I think in the case of Ankh, successful way to take player elimination. So I think it goes from being very fallow ground where like there's nothing really to be done to very fertile when somebody says, hey, let me take a second look at that with all that we've learned about board game design. It becomes really, really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And like we just had like this recently with memory games, right? With That's No Hat, where that is at its heart purely a memory game, but because it's almost
impossible. How dare you not know the name of the game you're speaking of?
Oh, sorry. That's Not a Hat? That's not
Thank you. The only reason this game is popular is because of the title, and you have to say, that's not a hat.
That's not a hat. But yeah, I mean, that is 100% a memory game top to bottom, but it's also a memory game that's designed so that no one could possibly remember anything in it. So the silliness is what comes to the forefront in it. And I think that that's brilliant. We're seeing roll and move having resurgence to some extent, like Thunder Road Vendetta, which I guess is not strictly a roll and move, definitely has aspects of like recreating the feeling of a roll and move by sort of steering it more in like a dice drafting direction. Like, I think that's really clever. I was talking about Undaunted earlier in this episode. That uses dice combat. Literally roll one die and that is the outcome of your thing. You don't see that.
It feels super outdated.
That is very outdated. And you don't see that much anymore. But yet in the context of Undaunted, because of the very specific genre it's recapturing, it works because it's not the only mechanic. Undaunted becomes more of a deck builder game in the course of the strategy of it than it is about just rolling a die and hoping for hits. I think that there are ways to use these mechanisms that subvert some of the datedness of it. We talk about Cthulhu Wars, for example, and like that is a game where you
get that name out of your mouth.
Sorry, yeah, I forgot that we're not talking about Cthulhu Wars anymore. But yeah, that is another game where you roll a ton of dice, but because of how many dice you're rolling through the wars, it works. It makes sense in the context of the game.
I feel like we've arrived at it depends. When Nealon made such a good claim in the upfront that I was excited to stick by.
I do think that there is one more interesting little thing I noticed that like is just anecdotal to this a little bit. There's a lot of people talking about Lorcana right now, right? Which is like Disney's collectible card game. And I feel like collectible card games, I thought, had their day. A lot of the industry had moved to what Fantasy Flight was doing with what they called living card games, where you buy the entire pool of cards and everyone had access to all of the cards. And who's doing Lorcana? Is it Ravensburger?
Ravensburger.
And Ravensburger, like embracing this idea. It's like buying booster packs and hope you get lucky with the good cards. And now I'm seeing people on Facebook talking about proxying cards so they can build decks. It just gave me like Magic the Gathering flashbacks, which was my big entry into that experience. And I did have the sense of like, I thought we left this behind. Why are we bringing this back? But at the same time, it did give me this little bit of a pang of like, oh man, not that I'm in danger of like starting to play Lorcana or anything like that. But there is something about the way that a specific mechanic works and how that can be appealing that I don't think you can just entirely discount as, oh, that had its point in the past,
Yeah, and I think sort of as you hinted at, like it does take some distance, even for like when you mentioned roll and rights. I don't think that's one of the four taboo or necessarily a super frowned upon mechanism, but it does feel like it's played out in a lot of ways to the way that legacy games felt like they sort of got played out. Right now, we're sort of in the midst of it, and we feel like there'll never be a moment for it. Or it's easy to feel that way, I guess I should say. But I wonder how many years it'll take or how long it'll take until those feel fresh again,
Or I'm starting to get the sense, I mean, at least from Kellen, even a little bit, that trick takers we're already tired of the trick taker wave. Right, Kellen?
No, I didn't say that.
I mean, I'm starting to get that way. I'm starting to get there. I'm starting to get there with trick takers. I'm starting to feel like inundated or like the market is sort of saturated when it comes to trick takers.
What says the man who just plays dirty old Euros all day long.
Dirty old
over and
Euros?
over. Yeah, dusty, dirty, same difference.
I just played, what's it called with you last week? What was that? It's a Haggis. Yeah, we played Haggis. I'm right in there. I'm right in the middle of it.
I don't think so.
You're still like super excited by the newest Trick Taker?
No. And in fact,
So what are you talking about?
No, because if it's Shinzawa, okay. If it's a redo of an old one, what I am annoyed with is all the publishers who are like, ooh, trick-taking games, we can make some money real quick. And now everyone's buying all of them.
You know what people should do? They should be like you know how like there's a board game and there's like the board game, the card game version? They should do like a blank, the trick-taking version of it. Like a trick-taking version of all those games. Like Brass, the trick-taking version.
I love it.
We should be charging for this level of insight.
That's right.
There is something interesting here, which I think throws back a little bit to what we were saying with video games and even what we're talking about right now, which is where the motivation is coming from, right? Are these trends driven by publishers or are they driven by consumers? For example, like to use the video game example again, I think we can all agree that split screen and couch co-op is one of those things that everyone would appreciate. There's no reason not to have it in your game, to like be very reductive about it. But the reality is that the market forces aren't there. There aren't enough people that still utilize it for it to be worthwhile to develop. So the cynical approach is to say like, okay, that's not worth the time and effort and the money to include that. And that could be said of like all of these publisher trends, right? Like the reason we're seeing so many trick-taking games in the market is because people are appreciating these trick-taking games right now. They're doing really well.
People are buying them, Neelan.
People are buying them, exactly.
We can't quantify whether they're appreciating them.
Well, sure, I suppose. But there is some extent to which you have to wonder when we talk about dated mechanics or anything like that, are we doing the things that we think are actually better for the designs of games, or are we doing the things that are just popular and trendy right now? I mean,
what
you
is
could say
the most cynical interpretation?
Almost certainly the latter.
And Fiend.
Which is probably true.
For as much as I dislike the overabundance of roll and writes, and now I'm starting to get a little weary when it comes to trick taking. Obviously, it makes sense. Like if there's a market, you've got to follow the market. And then it also, when the market sort of changes, it makes that changing point that much more interesting, you know? You can't really envision a world where trends aren't happening because that's just sort of the nature of the business or business in general. If something works, people are going to copy it and it makes sense to copy it. But when you get that next wave, that crest of it always feels interesting. You know, it feels like a burgeoning sort of like fertile new thing. Like, oh, now everybody's like exploring this space. So there's a negative to it, but there's also a positive. That initial point is quite interesting.
Mark, let me ask you this.
Okay.
Have you been having an abundance of yams lately?
Not as much as I would have wanted to.
Berries? Complex
no,
carbs?
abundance.
Oysters?
More than I should have. None. No oysters.
Dairy?
I've never had an oyster. Yeah, I've had an abundance of dairy.
You might be wondering why I'm asking these questions.
Very much so. Like, absolutely. I can't stress enough how much I'm wondering why the hell you're asking me these questions, because they're very weird.
These are all foods that make you more fertile.
Okay.
Which is a word that you can't stop saying over this episode.
I don't need any more help with that. Believe me, I'm virile to
I don't know.
Great extent. Not as much as Neelan with all his kids, but
yeah,
right up there. Trying.
Fatty fish?
Love fatty fish. Big salmon guy.
Yeah.
They call me Mark Salmon Besida because of all the salmon I eat.
Well, I think that we've made our point.
Yeah, very clearly. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of like one sentence just to finish it.
What a fertile topic.
Yes. Great. Thank you, Kellen. That is going to do it for this discussion of the time and place that board games have had and mechanics. And that's going to do it for the episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro music, What's in Your Mind, Kid? And thank you, Mark and Kellen, for being here yet again on the Board Game Barrage. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
What? Bye.